Do you really need Booleans? Well, it turns out they may not be as important as you might think. You see, Booleans are a tricky subject, and the question at hand doesn't have a simple answer. It depends on the type of modeling, your workflow, and what exactly you're using Booleans for. If you're doing organic modeling, you probably won't touch Booleans, and if that's the case, feel free to go back to modeling your carrots. That shit is pretty boring to me. We're gonna talk strictly about hard surface, which is where you'll use Booleans the most. And quick interruption, head over to blenderbros.com/free-guides if you want some more hard surface modeling resources. We have our hard surface ebook, a free course for beginners, and a few others you definitely don't want to miss. Now, Booleans are unique in that you can quickly iterate shapes and designs without locking in your changes. As a very basic example, if I take the default cube and inset the top face and extrude it in versus just adding a Boolean, I won't have as much control. With a Boolean, I can easily move it around and make rapid changes. With a destructive workflow where I'm physically working with the topology, I don't have that creative freedom. Now, the traditional form of modeling where you extrude, inset, use sub D and loop cuts and all that good stuff is still valid depending on your workflow. But here's the issue. Let's say you had a really big model, maybe a ship or something, and you wanted to utilize your traditional sub D workflow. Now imagine on that big ship, you wanted to make really small cuts inside of it, maybe for a vent or something. Your topology is gonna have to be so much more dense in order to get those small cuts on such a big object. But remember, with sub D, you need quad topology for the best results, and if you have a massive object with small cuts, you're gonna have to do all this extra modeling and possibly retopologizing just to get the cuts you want. And oftentimes this workflow isn't even needed. It's a waste of time. There are several more valid approaches you can take. One of the more traditional ones, which you can still use, especially in a game asset workflow, is to have your base mesh, which is lower poly without all those cuts, and a higher poly version with all the detail you want. Then you can bake it. So for example, if for whatever reason you needed a clean topology for your work, but didn't want to deal with all the extra modeling effort and retopologizing for those small details, you could instead use Booleans on the high poly version and your traditional sub D modeling on your lower poly version. Contrary to popular belief, yes, you can bake detail from an n-gon based mesh onto a clean quad based mesh. The only thing you need to do is ensure your mesh is properly triangulated with the triangulate modifier in that it doesn't have any geometry overlaps. That's it. With this approach, you can fuse your traditional sub D modeling with a more robust Boolean workflow. So you utilize Booleans for speed and your sub D approach for quality. So no matter how many n-gons or whatever mess the Boolean workflow causes, you can still bake that extra detail onto your clean mesh. This is something we've done in the past working with game studios, and plenty still use it. But with advancements in technology, I can't specifically tell you how practical baking is going to be in the long term, but it's still around and something to consider. So in summary, you can utilize a traditional sub D modeling workflow. Then you can take that model, duplicate it, and run your Booleans on it to get your higher poly version. That way, on the clean mesh, you don't need to physically model in all those small details. You can just bake it from the Booleans. Now, a situation where Booleans can actually be a waste of time is for those smaller tertiary details. Oftentimes, I have a bunch of small, subtle details that would take me ages to model in physically, and in these situations, I can use decals. Now, decals are essentially stickers that you can slap onto your model and get identical results in a fraction of the time. You basically take a decal library, which we have, using an add-on like Decal Machine, load up the decal you want, then place it on your object. No modeling required. Now, this isn't something you can use everywhere. For example, you can't just export these decals over to a game engine. This is where things get a little bit more complicated, requiring the use of trim sheets, atlas maps, and a few different techniques. That's a topic for another video. But for quick concepting, it's much better than using Booleans for every small detail. The main places you'll be using Booleans is during your modeling stage. When you're making your design, cutting in shapes, changing the structure, etc. These are when Booleans come in handy the most. And if you've seen my other tutorials, the majority of my workflow is with Booleans, but I happily supplement them whenever I can to save time. Now, I want to be clear, sub-D modeling is pretty outdated. I don't care what your 70-year-old professor says when they were taught this stuff in the 90s. It simply isn't needed as much anymore. If you're going for VFX, fine, you can use sub-D. If you need to deform your object, fine, use sub-D. And if you're working with organics, sub-D is going to be required, or at least quads if you're sculpting. But if you're doing hard surface modeling, whether that's for concept work, video games, or whatever else, the Boolean workflow reigns supreme. I've used a Boolean workflow with n-gons all over the place in my hard surface models, including with game studios, and it has never once been an issue. The reason for that is I know what I'm doing. Game asset workflows simply require a bit of a different approach, and I actually have a 3-hour-long tutorial I made a few years back if you want to learn more about a game asset approach. But stick with Booleans, use them when you need them, and replace them when it's simply a waste of time. Boolean workflow for hard surface modeling reigns supreme. Now, before I end this video, head over to blenderbros.com/free-guides and check out some of our other free hard surface modeling resources. You won't be disappointed. Take care and see you soon.